Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Courtney Cubey. I'm the NBC News Pentagon and National Security Correspondent, and it is my absolute pleasure to welcome you to today's session of this year's virtual edition of Defense One's annual Outlook Summit. Before we get started, we always have to do a little bit of housekeeping. In the top right hand of your screen, you'll see a Q&A tab. This is where you can ask your questions to Senator Shaheen. We'll be fielding questions towards the end of the interview, but I encourage you to submit them along the way and we'll keep looking at them. Also, in the top right-hand corner of your screen, you'll find a message icon, and that is where you can chat and interact with your fellow attendees or ask for any technical assistance. One rule I have for these is no criticizing the moderator on the chat. I see everything. I'm a mom, so I will call you out on it. And finally, this event is being recorded and will be available on demand shortly for you to share with your colleagues. And I think that's it. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce Senator Jeanne Shaheen. Senator Shaheen served as the first female governor of New Hampshire for 6 years before being sworn in as the state's first female senator in 2009. She is a top-ranking woman on the Armed Services Committee, and she is the only woman serving on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Senator Shaheen, thank you so much. Welcome. Thank you for being here with us today.
Well, thank you. It's very nice to join you, Courtney, and to join everybody who's watching virtually. I wish we could be in person, and hopefully in a few short months, we will be able to do that.
I think we all share that hope that we can, believe me. Well, let's just jump right in. So, Senator, you are a national security and foreign policy leader in the Senate. You are increasingly influential on the world stage as well. So I want to talk to you about how you see the Biden administration and how you see your role in that administration going forward. What issues will you press the Biden administration to prioritize?
Well, first of all, I think the new administration will try and restore relationships with many of our traditional allies those relationships have cooled during the Trump administration. And I think it will be very important to see us again resume those close relationships with Europe, with some of our allies in the Pacific as well. And I would see the administration, and President-elect Biden has already talked about this, about rejoining a number of the international organizations that are part of our global architecture. I think that will be very important, and to reaffirm our commitment to some of those traditional alliances like NATO that have come under some attack by the Trump administration. So I would hope that we will see that happen right away. Rejoining the Paris Climate Accords, which the president-elect has talked about, rejoining the World Health Organization. During this pandemic, I think it's very important for people to see the United States as a leader again, both on the pandemic, on climate, and in so many other areas where our absence has left a vacuum that has, in some cases, threatened security.
Alliance has been an issue from the very beginning with President-elect Trump. You know, it became very clear that that was going to be an issue for him. One other thing on the transition, we're about 6 weeks out from the election. We're a little under 6 weeks until the inauguration. There's been a lot of concern that there might be some national security crisis during this transition. Are that still worry you? Do you think that the U.S. might be past that concern? And if it does worry you, how are you concerned that could manifest? Senator, I think you might be muted.
Actually.
There we go. Gotcha now.
Okay. So, as I said, we've already seen some security threat manifest in the last week with the recognition that there has been cyber hacking into the parts of the Pentagon, the Department of State, Commerce. We're not exactly sure at this point how widespread that hacking is. I have joined with Senator Moran in a letter to the administration asking for a briefing on exactly what has happened here, to the FBI and to our intelligence agencies about how widespread this is. And we've already identified that it is part of the Russian intelligence service, we think, that has done this hacking. It's very sophisticated. And what we need to ensure in the new administration is that there's some accountability for this kind of action by our adversaries. I'm also concerned about the deadline that President Trump has set to withdraw our troops from Afghanistan and Iraq by mid-January. I think that leaves some of our soldiers on the ground in the Middle East and in Afghanistan open to threat from the Taliban and from other terrorists. So I think there are a number of reasons to be concerned about where we are and what's going to happen between now and January 20th.
So you feel confident, or you've been actually briefed, that Russian intelligence services were behind the attack? This is a recent hackers were able to exploit this software monitoring product called SolarWinds. Have you actually been briefed that Russians are behind it?
Briefed. As I said, that's what the news reports have suggested. That's why I have joined with Senator Moran to request further briefing. He is the chair and I'm the ranking member on the Commerce, Justice, and Science Subcommittee. We're concerned about what the impact will be on the Department of Commerce and, of course, what other impacts might be. And there's been very little transparency from the administration about exactly what's happened. I assume they're still investigating, but I think it's important for Congress to understand exactly what happened there.
Yeah. What is it? You've been very outspoken about Vladimir Putin, Russian aggression, even to the point of being sanctioned by him and by the Russian government. What does it say that the Russian government just continues to carry out attacks like this, cyber attacks like this, virtually with impunity? And can you say a little bit more about what you think the Biden administration might be able to do to stop this or curb it?
Well, I think one of the challenges during the Trump years has been the mixed messages that have been sent by the administration to Russia. The embrace by Donald Trump of Vladimir Putin, his accepting what Putin has to say just without any further questioning. And I think that has made it very difficult for us to make it clear to Russia that a number of the actions that they have taken are unacceptable and that we are going to hold them accountable. And this latest hack is an example of that.
I want to get into, sorry, go ahead.
Also, what I think the Biden administration will do. I don't think we will see President Biden embrace Vladimir Putin in the same way that we have seen President Trump do that. I think we will see a more consistent message from the administration about how we're going to handle actions by the Russian government and those that we suspect are directed by the Russian government. And there will be some responses to those in the way that we have not seen under this administration. We passed CATSA sanctions, the sanctions against Russia, almost unanimously in both the House and Senate. And they have never really been fully implemented by this administration. Again, that's an example of the kind of mixed message that has been sent that is not in the interest of our national security. There are places where we ought to be able to work with the Russians. The extension of the New START treaty is one of those. And President Biden has indicated that he thinks we should extend that treaty. That can be done without congressional approval. And we can continue to examine how we can make that treaty work better, how we might be able to include the Chinese and some of the other activities that are nefarious. But in the meantime, we ought to extend the New START treaty. And I'm pleased that President-elect Biden has talked about that.
I mean, he's only going to have about 2 weeks after being sworn in to actually do that before New START expires. Do you feel confident that he will, and would you encourage him to extend it right off the bat when he gets into office?
I would. It's something that I have been talking about for about 2 years now, in terms of the current administration urging them to extend the treaty, recognizing that it's not perfect, that it doesn't include all of the actors because China's not participating, that it doesn't include all of the weapons that we might like for it to. But in the meantime, if we extend the treaty, then we continue to have insight into exactly what Russia is doing with their nuclear arsenal. And I think it is a way for us to continue contact that is very important as we're looking at how we need to continue to think about Russia and to work with them as an adversary, recognizing that there are some areas where there is agreement.
Do you think, 6 months or a year, and then continuing to negotiate and try and bring China in, would that be adequate?
I think that's the new administration is going to have to do some analysis and make their determination about what makes sense there.
Okay. I want to go back to something that you mentioned a minute or two ago, Afghanistan and the troop withdrawals. The Pentagon announced recently that they're going down to 2,500 in less than a month in Afghanistan. You have pretty consistently said that you think that this needs to be a conditions-based decision, but this was clearly not conditions-based. In fact, the past several decisions to draw down has not been conditions-based. But under the peace agreement with the Taliban, the U.S. and NATO could be completely out of Afghanistan in May of 2021. And the defense ministers meeting at NATO in February is going to discuss this and presumably is going to decide whether all troops will leave. Will you press the Pentagon and the Biden White House to encourage at the NATO meeting and beyond, to encourage a continued presence in Afghanistan of 2,500 or more, and encourage NATO to stay as well?
As you pointed out, the discussions with the Taliban, the agreement that was signed last year, or earlier this year, were conditions-based. The Taliban was supposed to stop their attacks on U.S. to tone down the violence. They were supposed to renounce al-Qaeda. They've not done either of those things. They have the defense of the Afghan constitution, the protection of minority rights, of women's rights. There's been no commitment to that. Women have not really been at the table in those negotiations. It's disappointing, and it seems like the Trump administration made the decision, we're going to withdraw from Afghanistan. He said he was going to bring our troops home. His plan is to do that before he leaves office, regardless of the consequences. And that's what I worry about. I think if we have a potential agreement with the Taliban, then we need to hold their feet to the fire so that they comply with what they agreed to in that agreement. And they certainly have not done that.
Mm-hmm. But, I mean, President-elect Biden, he has talked in the past about wanting to maintain some sort of a counter-terror presence there. And the numbers are all over the map, of 2,000 up to 4,000, whatever it is. But he has also said that the U.S. needs to stop fighting the wars of the past. So, what do you think? Do you think he may actually advise, or do you have any sense, if you had any conversations with him or advisors around him, that he might actually advise to go forward with the agreement and pull all troops out in May?
I've had any discussions with any members of the future administration, or potential members of the future administration, about Afghanistan. I'm actually going to be able to speak with General Austin, who's been nominated to be Secretary of Defense, later today. It's one of the questions that I'm going to raise with him. I think if we totally withdraw from Afghanistan without some reassurance that the government, the elected government of Afghanistan, is able to continue their fight, and they have some agreement with the Taliban that can continue, that can provide protections for people. Some of the things that some of the American values, the democratic values that we have tried to support in Afghanistan that have been important to the Afghans. I was there most recently in 2019. And one of the things I did as the discussions were beginning with the Taliban, and I had a meeting with a number of Afghan women leaders, and they talked about the need to reach an agreement, that they were tired of war, that they had lost family members and friends, and they understood the costs of war, and they didn't want it to continue. But they were also worried about what was going to happen to them, and what was going to happen to the rights that were written into the Afghan constitution, and how women and children and families girls continue to be able to be in school. And what we've seen in certain areas controlled by the Taliban is the answer to that is no. So I worry that we have spent a lot of blood and treasure at the sacrifice of so many of our soldiers and so many Afghans. And I don't think we should just walk away without some assurance that there would be peace in Afghanistan that has been negotiated, that Afghans can believe in, that will provide protections for people there.
The women, women and children and protecting them, despite the fact we hear from President Ghani and we've heard from Ambassador Khalilzad that they are prioritizing that. You talk to people sort of behind the scenes and they say that's just not the case, that is not one of the higher priorities. Is there any way, though, that the U.S. can really try to enforce that or can do anything about it? I mean, at this point, it's really the intra-Afghan dialogue piece with the Taliban and the Afghan government. So does the U.S. have the influence to be able to do anything to protect these women and these girls in some peace agreement and beyond the agreement?
Well, I think we can continue to pressure both the Afghan government, who have been reluctant to include women fully as part of their delegation, as well as the Taliban. We had several hearings with Secretary of State Pompeo, where he and I went back and forth quite intensely, and he refused to make a commitment that one of our negotiating conditions should be that the rights of women and of other minorities in Afghanistan who have been mistreated and terrorized by the Taliban, that they would be protected. And again, I think that has been one of the underpinnings of our effort there. And it's unfortunate if we just walk away from that at this point. We should continue to pressure the Afghans to ensure that this happens. And we need to continue to worry about the threat from terrorist groups. We have not gotten a commitment from Pakistan that they will shut down the terrorist networks that have safe haven in Pakistan, whether it be the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, the Haqqani network. We have not been able to make our case to the Pakistanis that this is something that's very important to do, and we need to do that. We know that ISIS has started resurging in Afghanistan. Now, fortunately, at this point, they've been held at bay, but that is also a potential threat. So the fact that we may need to keep a counterterrorism force there for some time, I think is probably very real.
Yeah, I mean, as they've been denied essentially a caliphate in Iraq and Syria, if there's an opening in Afghanistan, it would make sense for ISIS to move there and try to exploit that location.
That's right. What we don't want to see is the situation that happened in Iraq, where our soldiers pulled out, then we saw ISIS come back. We had to go back in, and we don't want that to happen in Afghanistan.
Is that something that you're going to press? I mean, Lloyd Austin, who you're meeting with today, he was the one who oversaw the drawdown in Iraq in 2011, and then at CENTCOM commander putting troops back in after Mosul fell. Are you going to talk to him about that today and about his role in both of those endeavors?
I think it would be very important to hear what he believes the lessons learned from our experiences in Iraq are, and how he thinks that translates not just to where we are in the Middle East and Afghanistan, but to the future lessons as we look at the challenges that we're facing from China, from Russia, the sort of the new great power competition that has been identified as our biggest security threats.
What do you need to hear from Lloyd Austin to vote in favor of him getting a waiver? You voted for Mattis to get his, I believe, but what is it that you need to hear from him today so that you'll give him a waiver?
Well, I want to be able to learn more about his background. I certainly know of him. I haven't ever worked closely with him. I don't know a lot about, other than the kind of anecdote you just mentioned about his experience in the military. So I want to know more about that. I want to hear his views about what he believes the biggest threats to the United States are and how he thinks we ought to approach those threats. And so really listening to that and hearing what he says. We're going to have hearings in the Armed Services Committee to bring him before the committee. I want to hear how he responds to questions with the committee. So I'm going to, as I always try to do, I'm going to listen to what he has to say. I'm going to try and get as much information as I can and then make the decision.
You wrote and passed the Women, Peace, and Security Act, which your website describes as prioritizing the inclusion of women in all matters concerning national security, including conflict prevention and peace building. It's clear, even just from our discussion here today, that that's something that you feel passionate about. But, President-elect Biden passed over Michelle Flournoy, who was long expected to be his selection to be Secretary of Defense. She would be the first woman. She's also, of course, was served as the first woman as policy at the Pentagon, so the number 3 at the Pentagon. Do you agree with his decision to pass over Michelle Flournoy? And what message does that send to other women in national security and in the military that it seems like a woman came so close to getting the job and then was passed over?
Well, the nomination of General Austin is also an historic nomination. And I think my experience with Michelle Flournoy was that she's very competent. She did a very good job in the time that she was at the Pentagon. And obviously I would have loved to see her nominated. But I think General Austin is also an historic choice. And what I learned as governor in New Hampshire is that the person in charge is the person who gets to make those decisions. And so I think President Biden made the decision based on who he was comfortable with, who he thought he could work with, and it now will be up to the Senate to determine whether we agree with that.
Will you seek assurances that Lloyd Austin, if confirmed, will put women in other senior positions at the Pentagon?
Oh, you bet I will. I intend to ask him about women in the military, about some of what have been hot button issues, things like sexual assault in the military. I intend to ask him about the Women, Peace, and Security implementation, which actually has moved well. The Department of Defense has been supportive of that effort. And so I want to ensure that that continues. We have language in the defense bill that would provide some additional support for that effort, gender advisors that could work with our military units in the field. And so I think it's very important. I mean, a perfect example, as we were just saying, is Afghanistan. One of the things, and the reason this is important, and I think this is the piece that a lot of people miss or haven't seen the data. But what we know is that when women are at the negotiating table in conflicts, that when those negotiations end and agreement has been reached, if women have been part of that, then those agreements last much longer, 30% longer, and that there is a better chance for implementation. So this is not something that, oh, well, it would be nice because I'm a woman and I want to see other women involved. This is something that the data shows makes a difference in how we end conflicts and how we negotiate those endings and how long they last. And that's the point. That's why it would be very important, would have been very important to have Afghan women at the negotiating table in greater numbers, because they will make a difference in how that any peace agreement gets implemented.
Mm-hmm. What do you think, and domestic politics, do you think that Senator McConnell will give the Biden administration, the incoming administration, any members of his national security team right off the bat? We had Secretary Mattis came in literally on day one. Do you think that there's any members that will be confirmed and ready to go on day one?
Well, I hope so. I think it would be important, not just in terms of our national security. Obviously, that's absolutely critical, but it's a very important message to send to the American people. We're negotiating an agreement to try and help those people who are suffering because of the pandemic. And there was a bipartisan group that I was part of that worked for about a month on trying to come to some agreement, and we handed that agreement off to leadership. But one of the things we said as we made that announcement on Monday is that one of the most important aspects, we thought, of what we had done was to show the American people that we can work together to address the concerns that they have and to do what's in the best interest of this country. And people are really looking for that, I believe. I think they want to see us stop the divisiveness, stop the partisanship, and start working together. So I hope that we will see that from the Republican majority in the Senate.
How do you, I mean, this is totally politics, but how do you see the fact that President Trump keeps holding over the Republicans the fact that he wants to run for president again in 4 years? I mean, is that going to, how do you see that impacting the potential for maybe decreasing the partisanship in Washington? Do you think do you think Republicans really will be able to try to cross the aisle and work on issues when they have President Trump maybe potentially running in a few years again, and they seem to be so beholden to him right now?
Courtney, I don't get it. I don't understand why there are Republicans in Congress who would violate their oath of office, the allegiance to the Constitution that each of us took when we got sworn in to defend this country and oppose one of the most basic underpinnings of our democracy, which is a peaceful transfer of power. It is mind-boggling to me, and I think borders on, it certainly borders on sedition that we have members of Congress who are suggesting that this was not a free and fair election after Donald Trump's own Attorney General, William Barr, said, yes, it was a free and fair election. When the courts have stood up and said there is no evidence that's been presented, and it is a purely political move that is to the detriment of the United States and the democracy that we all hold dear.
Are there any Republicans right now that you're looking at that you might be able to form alliances with? Or, I mean, is there another John McCain sort of waiting in the wings who you think is going to be a leader in the national security and foreign policy world who you might be able to work with?
Well, sure. And we work together all the time. As you know, this is the 60th year that the defense bill has been passed with bipartisan support, bicameral support in both the House and Senate. And I think that is a very good signal. I think here in the final weeks of 2020 and the final weeks of this Congress that we're seeing some real bipartisan activity, which is very important, and very important to say to the American people, we are working together in the best interests of America.
Kayleigh McEnany yesterday, I think it was, in the White House briefing room, said that the president still plans to veto the NDAA over objections to renaming the bases. He also has objections to some language about withdrawing troops from Afghanistan and Germany. And then, of course, he's angry that the NDAA doesn't outlaw some legal protections for social media companies. What do you think is going to happen? Do you think he's going to veto it? And if he does, or could he just let the clock run out on Congress and not sign it at all? And how will Congress respond to whatever he does?
Well, what we saw in the votes in both the House and Senate is that if everyone voted on a presidential veto in the same way that we voted on the legislation, there are enough votes to override the veto. What President Trump is going to do, I think it's anyone's guess. It's unfortunate that someone who has touted his support for our men and women in the military would talk about vetoing a bill that is so critical to our national security, that includes a 3% pay raise for the men and women serving. So I think it is very hard to defend that action.
But he could theoretically just let the Congress go to recess and then just let it run out. And then if it's not signed before he leaves office, then you have to start over, right, in January with the next Congress?
My understanding that bills can become law without his signature.
He can, so they could go forward and sign it before the bill could come into law before President Trump leaves office still.
I probably should double check that before I say, but at least when I was governor, the process was you could sign a bill, you could veto a bill, and you could let a bill become law without your signature. And I think we have that same process here in Washington.
One thing that I was curious of, one of your priorities in the NDAA was the $2.2 billion for the Pacific Deterrence Initiative. Can you explain a little bit about why that is critical to the NDAA?
You know, I think as I said earlier, and as you know, of course, part of our national defense strategy recognizes that the environment has changed, and now we are in a renewed great power competition as we look at the future. I think our most immediate adversary has been Russia. As we just talked about the cyber hacking, we saw what Russia did in Ukraine. We've seen Russian action to try and disrupt our election. But probably the longer term and more concerning threat is that from China. And it's a military threat. It's also an economic threat. As we look at what China is doing, the growth in the Chinese economy, their GDP is about to surpass the United States. We know that they have a very aggressive diplomatic and economic initiative that's going across not just Southeast Asia, but all the way into Europe and South America, where they are providing assistance. In Africa, they have really, their Belt and Road Initiative is designed to persuade the rest of the world that China has the answers to how we should be governed in the future. And they are investing heavily in that economic assistance, heavily in diplomacy, at a time when over the last few years, we've actually reduced the amount of money that we're spending on diplomacy in the United States. So I think as we think about what that long-term threat is from China, it's very important for us to have a strategy for how we're going to address it. And that's part of what the Pacific Deterrence Initiative is about. It's modeled on what we did in Europe, the European Deterrence Initiative, as we looked at the aggression from Russia and the potential to undermine some of the progress in Europe, the post-World War II progress. It's an effort to look at what the threat is in the Pacific and think about how we respond to that.
But it seems as if the European Defense Initiative was really more focused on a concern about some sort of a kinetic response from Russia, whereas the Pacific and China is more of a concern about economic or technological threat that comes from China. You also co-sponsored the America Leads Act, which I was curious, or I was interested to see focuses on building, in part, on building an economy in the U.S. as a means to counter China. So, I mean, I guess the question becomes, do you think that the bigger threat from China right now is a kinetic one, something in the South China Sea, something, or is it more of a Cold War concern with China that the U.S. might be in right now that's on an economic basis with trade and intellectual property theft, and that's more of the concern?
Well, I think it's all of the above, actually, and I think that's what those, particularly the lead legislation, is designed to address. And, you know, as we look at what has been our response to China over the last few years, there was first an effort to embrace Xi, then the tariff fight began, and it's been a pretty inconsistent message in terms of how we have dealt with China. And I think we've got to look at that. And what better example do we need of the importance of bringing a supply chain back to the United States than what we've seen during the COVID pandemic? You know, the fact that we've had, they're calling it, that's called a vote here. But as we've seen how few companies, the need for personal protective equipment is probably the biggest example, that so much of that PPE has not been manufactured here in the United States. And a lot of it has come from China and from other countries. We need to ensure that the supply chain that's critical to our national security that we've got that in the United States, that those products are being manufactured here, that if we're talking about, one of the things that's in the NDAA is a study to look at rare earth minerals that now we're relying on China for. And we used to get many of those in the United States, but we've stopped mining them here. And to take a look at what kinds of things do we need to ensure that we can produce in the United States in a crisis.
Since we have I want to get to like 2 or 3 more topics since you had your vote call there. Staying in the region, North Korea, what do you see happening with North Korea under a Biden administration? Do you think that there could be, could we see a President Biden going and meeting with Kim Jong-un at some point? And are you worried that they may restart their nuclear testing and ballistic missile testing program when Biden comes into office?
Well, they've already started it. I do think it was the brief rapprochement with North Korea that Donald Trump had was helpful in terms of delaying some of their testing and their weapons development. Unfortunately, it was not followed up with the kind of hard-nosed diplomacy and consistent messaging that we need with a country like North Korea. And it also didn't include, to the extent that we really need to, our allies, because that's one of the most important things, one of the most important assets that we have in America in terms of our national security. It is the allies that we have around the world. And certainly Japan and South Korea and other countries in the Asian Pacific share our concern about what's happening in North Korea. The Chinese, we know that there have been some concerns on the part of China about what North Korea is doing. And we need to look at where we can find common cause with our adversaries like China. And when it comes to what North Korea is doing, that's one place where we might be able to do that. Just as we were able to get help from Russia and China as we were trying to negotiate an end to building nuclear weapons by Iran. And so building those international alliances and relationships is critical as we think about the threats to the future.
Do you have any indications that North Korea has really, I mean, we know that they've probably have been in some sort of a production phase with their ballistic missiles during this lag in actual launches. But do you have any indications that they may have actually made any advances, like, miniaturizing warheads, a delivery via reentry vehicle that, doesn't burn up on reentry? Is there anything like that you can share, advances they may have made during this diplomatic opening?
I don't have any classified information, and of course I wouldn't be able to share it if I had it. So I'm looking at what we've seen from open source reporting.
You always got to try. You never know.
I know.
I want to ask you a little bit more about American leadership abroad as well. President-elect Biden said that recently, we must build a foreign policy that leads with diplomacy, revitalizes alliances, and putting American leadership back at the table and rallying the world to meet global threats to our security. How, again, as somebody who is increasingly on the world stage as a U.S. leader in the Senate, national security and foreign policy, how would you advise the Biden administration, particularly his national security and foreign policy sort of apparatus, how would you advise them to rally the world and to reopen some of these relationships that have been tested under a Trump administration?
Well, given Joe Biden's long experience in foreign policy, I'm not sure that I need to advise him, and he is certainly talking about the kinds of things that I think are very important. Trying to restore relationships with some of our allies who were caught quite by surprise by some of the actions of the current administration. The announcement that we were going to withdraw our troops from Germany certainly was a surprise to the Germans. I think that's not the best way to build relationships. And I don't think that is an action that is in long term in our best interest. So I do think his commitment and his announcing that he sees this as critical. I have had an opportunity to talk with some of the nominees and choices for national security and foreign policy officials in the new administration, and they have all reiterated their commitment to looking at our relationships with our allies, our traditional allies, and working hard to restore those relationships, at looking at the importance of reemerging with our democratic values on the world stage. I'll give you a good example. Just yesterday, I was on part of a program that was coming from Berlin with several Europeans, looking at what we might do to better support democracy in Bosnia. This is the 25th anniversary of the Dayton Accords. And sadly, in so many ways, we haven't seen the progress from Bosnia-Herzegovina that many of us hoped when the Dayton Accords were signed. And one of the things that the Europeans talked about was the importance of seeing the United States come back and support efforts like we need to undertake in Bosnia to continue to support their fragile democracy that they have there, that has been so troubled by failure to adhere to the rule of law and corruption in the government. So it's that kind of effort that I think we've got to look at again and rejoin. One of the most important lessons for me during my time in the Senate on the Foreign Relations and Armed Services Committees has been learning that how important the role of the United States is around the world. And that if we withdraw from our commitments, we leave a vacuum, and that vacuum is most often filled by people who are our adversaries, who don't have the same intent to promote human rights and democratic values around the world. And so restoring that leadership, I think, is going to be very important, and it's going to be something we have to work at. You know, I think it will be very helpful to have us re-engage and fully support NATO again. It's something that I believe in. It's been the most successful alliance in world history, really, the defensive alliance. And it's one reason that Tom Tillis and I have restarted the Senate NATO Observer Group. But part of that also is to encourage our allies to keep their commitments, the funding commitment that our NATO allies have made, not to NATO per se, as we know, because the commitment is to national security in their own countries and how much of their budgets they will spend on those military and NATO security efforts. But to ensure that that continues. And one of the conversations we had yesterday about Bosnia is that the United States has sanctioned one of the Bosnian leaders who, Milorad Dodik, who is now one of the 3 presidents in Bosnia, who has been the head president of the Republic of Srpska, which has been talking about seceding from Bosnia almost since the Dayton Accords were signed. And we have sanctioned him, but our European friends have not. The EU needs to look at how they can provide both incentives and disincentives. So where are there places where they need to look at what's happening with backsliding in democracies, and how can we work together to address that?
Will you encourage Lloyd Austin, assuming he's confirmed as Secretary of Defense, will you encourage him to reverse any of the decisions of, because I mean, the decision to pull troops out of Germany and move them around the region, a lot of that hasn't been done yet. It can still be stopped and reversed. Would you encourage that from him or of President-elect Biden?
Well, I would encourage the new administration to do their own analysis and to work with the Germans in terms of the German troops and NATO in terms of making those decisions, and ensure that they share the belief that it is in our national interest to withdraw those troops. I have reservations about that, as I've noted. Just had reservations about and downright opposition to the Trump administration's withdrawal of the troops from northeastern Syria. And of course, Secretary Mattis resigned over that decision, but I was there with Lindsey Graham in the summer of 2018, and I saw very directly how important it was to the Syrian people that we were there, that we were supporting stability in that region, that we had a presence on the ground that said America cares about what's happening here, and we are going to be at the table. We are not going to let the Iranians and the Russians and Assad and now the Turks determine the outcome of Syria without being at the table. And it's unfortunate that while we still have some troops in Syria, they're down. Their assignment is to guard the oil fields. I mean, that raises concerns, I think, from the Syrians and from others, that our only interest is parochial. It's not in the interest of supporting stability and peace and democratic human rights values in the region.
We have to wrap it up, but just one last question. You think, so you would advise the Trump administration, or I'm sorry, the Biden administration, you would advise them to maintain the troop presence in Syria, to maintain that alliance, or potentially even increase it and expand the role of U.S. troops there?
Well, I was talking about my opposition to the administration's removal of our troops in northeast Syria when they did that at the beginning of 2019. So the circumstances on the ground have changed dramatically since then, and obviously it's something that the new administration will have to decide what makes the most sense there. I hope they will consult with Congress, and I hope it will be part of a broader strategy toward the Middle East.
Senator Shaheen, thank you. I know you have to go off to your votes, and you've been so generous with your time today. We really appreciate and thank you for joining us. Be sure, everyone, to stay tuned for a word from Outlook 2021's exclusive underwriter, Cisco, and make sure to tune back in tomorrow at 11 a.m. Eastern Time for the final interview in the Outlook 2021 series. It's a conversation with your colleague, Senator Angus King, Representative Mike Gallagher, moderated by Patrick Tucker, the technology editor at Defense One. Senator Shaheen, it really has been an honor and a pleasure. And again, I thank you for your time today.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I'm Daniela Fair, publisher at Defense One, and I'm excited to continue today's conversation with Jeanne Robertson. Jeanne is Senior Operations Director of DoD at Cisco. Thanks for joining me today, Jeanne.
Thanks, Danielle. It's a pleasure to speak with you again.
Jeanne, I'm hoping you can just take a moment before we get into our discussion, just to tell the audience a little bit about yourself, your background, and how you arrived at the current role you have at Cisco.
Absolutely. So I have responsibility for the Cisco's Department of Defense business. I've been in this role for about a year. Prior to this role, I ran Cisco's architecture business for federal. That's where we developed our first hosted cloud collaboration solution for government. And prior to Cisco, I spent time at Oracle and CA. So my background prior to Cisco is primarily in the application space.
Great. I think that really helps our audience understand your point of view. The DoD is facing multiple challenges, to include various multi-vendor approaches to the DoD enterprise environment. Some of the issues, as outlined by various senior leaders across DoD, is bridging the tactical edge to the enterprise environment, supporting episodic demands, building resilient infrastructure to scale technology, and addressing data silos. So I'm hoping you can help start by just telling us what are some of your thoughts on how Cisco can help DoD address these particular challenges.
Yes, so the goal is to enable mission success without the worries of technology. Technology should enable the mission and not be a hindrance. The recently published DoD data strategy vision statement highlights that the DoD is a data-centric organization. It uses data at speed and scale for operational advantage and increased efficiency. Additionally, it recognizes that data is a strategic asset and therefore it must be operationalized. Having said that, it's critical to take a platform approach when talking about edge to cloud, and you must build a foundation when you're going to operationalize data. Cisco's approach is to help the DoD build a foundational platform for their operations. We recognize that to do that, to provide all of the necessary, we do not provide all the necessary pieces and parts and solutions or parts that go into the solution. We know that the DoD is going to operate in a multi-vendor environment. And these are similar challenges that we see facing all of our customers, not just the DoD. It's why Cisco's made it a priority to really develop solutions with open APIs to support third-party integrations. It's also why Cisco's made an investment to establish a DevNet community.
So let me ask you this, Jeanne. Can you share with our audience like a particular example or examples of Cisco enabling multi-vendor interoperability?
Yeah, so there's two good examples. So the first is our Cisco HCSD, and that's a hosted cloud collaboration solution, and it's Impact Level 5. And it's the only Impact Level 5 collaboration solution available to the DoD today. It is an open standard cloud option, and it allows for seamless integration into Microsoft. So it allows them to deliver demand collaboration capabilities to service members. Because it's a cloud offering, it offers flexibility, simplicity, and most important, affordability. It allows for faster deployment of new services, as most cloud solutions do. The second example is really around security and zero trust. We all hear the importance of, and the DoD is focused on a zero trust architecture. Cisco's zero trust architecture secures connections of applications, microservices, or containers, regardless if they reside in a data center or a cloud, or in the soon-to-be Microsoft Jedi cloud. And knowing that the security architectures were always going to be multi-vendor, Cisco developed an exchange grid called PX Grid. And so what PX Grid allows the DoD to do is to really integrate multiple security products, and then allows them to have the ability to share data and work together. This will be a key to the DoD as they move forward with the zero trust architecture.
So you mentioned.
I was going to add one to that. We recognize that all of our solutions are going to reside in multi-vendor environments, as we just mentioned with security. We've made a significant investment in the DevNet platform, which environment and community, what I mentioned earlier. And this allows third-party unique government solutions to be easily integrated into the Cisco platforms. And the commitment to the go ahead. I'm sorry, Danielle.
No, that's quite all right. Go ahead.
So our commitment to DevNet can be shown by that we've introduced certifications for our DevNet environments into our Cisco networking academies, and the services use our Cisco networking academies as part of their formal training process.
Got it. That's what I was going to ask about on DevNet on that front. Does DevNet provide an interoperability platform other than security? Because you're using that as an example.
Absolutely. It supports numerous platforms, including networking, IoT, mobility, data center, and collaboration, which I had mentioned earlier.
Great. So, Sean, give me an example of a DoD customer leveraging these capabilities. I'm sure our audience wants to hear about those pilots out there or programs that are operating right now.
So, absolutely. So, the first one that comes to mind is the virtual pilot ship within the Navy, and that's they're looking at the weapon systems on the Aegis class submarine, and they use the Cisco platform, which is essentially a cloud deployed on the ship, and it's an open standard software-based platform that allows integration with all solutions and allows to give them capabilities to the sailors seamlessly and to build ad hoc services. And so it's currently been deployed on an Aegis class ship and is out for testing as we speak.
There's been a lot of buzz about 5G lately. I know at Defense One, we're certainly covering it a lot and plan to be discussing it into 2021. How does Cisco play in 5G for the Department of Defense?
That's a great question. So obviously it's been top of mind in the DoD, and it's also very much top of mind for Cisco. Often when folks think about 5G, they think about the RF component of it, or the radio frequency component. And what 5G does is it really increases the ability to deliver capabilities out at the edge, but it also allows for additional capacity. So adding a lot more connected devices. Think Internet of Things, right? It's a big place there. With the increase in capacity and the increase in the number of connected devices, the question becomes, will their infrastructure be able to support or provide security and agility to support these additional connections? And what Cisco brings together is our software-defined capability in the networking, along with private 5G, to provide the robust platform that will improve the productivity and efficiency in the critical operations. We're currently engaged in supporting initiatives in 5G in areas around manufacturing today. In some of the other areas where it's going to be it's going to help provide solutions to be around warehousing, shipyards, and depots.
Sean, to bring us full circle, and I know you mentioned IBN or intent-based networking. How does IBN enable DoD interoperability?
Yeah, so an architectural approach driven by intent-based networking, and we talked a little bit earlier about operationalizing data, is really around the mission thread from the edge to the cloud. And this integrated approach will enable the DoD to better manage and control the resiliency, security, and performance when you start talking about delivering services to the edge all the way from the cloud. It helps assure the delivery of highly reliable, available services the DoD requires for successful missions.
Well, Sean, I think you and I could probably spend hours talking about this. There's just so much to cover, but I want to thank you for taking the time to speak with me today and share your insights with our audience. I think it's been a very valuable conversation. I certainly learned something. And I want to thank Cisco for supporting this year's Defense One's Outlook 2020 as our elite underwriter. Today's program certainly would not be possible without their partnership. Many thanks to our audience for being with us today. We encourage you to tune in to our other Defense One Outlook sessions and share them with your colleagues who might be interested. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Daniela.